All right, cool. But then I will get us started. So hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of the Heroes of Data Roundtable. So as per usual, you have your hosts here, Sara Landfors, that's me, and Krochmal. And what we try to do here on this roundtable is we share ideas for how data professionals can improve their communication with business stakeholders and also with each other. And today we have two amazing guests. So we have Kate and Felix, and I will let you introduce yourselves. Felix, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm Felix Holmgren, and for this context, I guess I represent the backenders in the world, those people that you sometimes are forced to collaborate with as a data professional. I actually started doing more, let's say, front-endy or like graphical stuff, but gradually I started to realize that like all that stuff that I thought was boring, like databases, is really the most interesting things that there are. And I've been sometimes doing freelance consulting, which I'm doing now since a couple of years, and sometimes working as an employee in companies. And I worked with G in a joint academy where I was a few different things, but I think the last title I had was platform tech lead or something like that. So yeah, I came in and was one of the main developers for the backend and sort of evolved into the platform team. So doing all kinds of stuff on the back end and databases and deployment and stuff like that.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we're excited to have you here. And Kate, who are you?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Kate, or Ekaterina Kuleshova, if it will be the full name. I've been working as a data and business analyst for around 7 years. And yeah, the last year I've been working as an analytics team lead in a company called Budbee, and it's where I met Yi, and that's how I ended up here at this podcast.
Yeah,
and I'm going to represent the sad analytics part in this communication situation.
Exactly. And the theme for the episode today is that time it wasn't the backend team's problem. Yi, do you want to take us through the entirely hypothetical scenario for that?
Sure. Time to fire up my speed reading skills, and it's a story time with Uncle G in 20 seconds or more. All right, this episode's entirely hypothetical scenario goes as follows. In different rooms of a dark and empty startup office sit Alice the analyst and Bob the backender. Alice is working hard on creating ELT transformations that provide Celia the CEO with the data that she needs, but it's going slow. The sales table contains all the millions of product sales that the company has ever made, but it also contains the sales of the office furniture and supplies because the company bought those from themselves. Don't ask. Out of the 40 million rows, she needs to filter out 77, randomly chosen number, don't ask, every time she wants to make a report. What's worse is that the table is not indexed on sale ID, so it's very slow to do so, increasing execution time as well as turnover time and necessary know-how. Alice sends a Slack message to Bob to make a plea that the backend team create a table that differentiates between office supplies and other sales. She doesn't have access to the app database. In the other room sits Bob, the backender. He's working hard on features that he needs to deliver tomorrow morning. There's an important investor coming, and out of the 9 features Celia the CEO wants to show to swoon the investor, currently only 2 exist. Bob wants to implement best practices at least 2% of the time so that his work next sprint won't be a living hell. Bob notices his unread Slack messages ticking from 889 to 890. It's probably Alice again, he thinks to himself. In the morning, Celia the CEO sits down at her desk with her cup of matcha tea. She scrolls through her emails. Alice has written something to her about telling Bob to please prioritize some material viewfinder or something. There's probably going to be time for that in 2027, Celia thinks to herself as she opens her investor presentation titled Data-Driven Everything. Have you, our esteemed guests, any of you ever been in any situation that is anything similar to this?
I think I've rarely been in a situation that is not similar to this.
All right, so the problem exists.
Yes.
What really struck me this time when I heard you read it is how similar this is to like the classical divide and beef between developers and DBAs, database administrators, which is like not a big thing in normal or like small companies these days, I guess, because developers are more directly in charge of databases usually, but there are many, like it's a classic theme of kind of exactly the same thing, but with the developer in the shoes of the data analyst and the DBA being the mean gatekeeper. I don't know if we can get into that later, but I think many of the ways that backend developers think, like their relationship to the database, I think my impression is it's to a big extent shaped by those experiences in the past of not like, for example, the inclination to do things in backend code rather than in the database, like to not really take full advantage of the database system's capabilities. I think that kind of comes from that. Like if you put things in the database, if you put more logic there, you're less in control of it. But if you can do it in your own programming language on the back end in your application, then you're in control. You don't hand it over to that realm of the DBA. So it's yeah, I think it's a strikingly similar situation.
So is this like a legacy then, a tradition of dirt rolling downhill? The database administrators sat on all the power, and then backenders were empowered to take care of their own databases through RDS instances and what have you, the cloud offerings, and now they take it out on the poor data engineers and analysts.
Yeah, exactly, it's a multi-generational cycle of abuse.
All right, so in 10 years, we will be having an episode where, you know, business analysts sit and complain about how data analysts
I
don't
think that's all
empower
you
them.
can hope for. Yeah.
Like multi-generational trauma of the database.
Right. Is this already when we start getting productive about things, or no?
But maybe I'm curious here, Kate, because you said, you know, you rarely have this not happen. What could you describe a little bit more? Like, is it how much, how frequently, you know, what are you, how is that experience for you?
I mean, it mostly depends on the company and a project, obviously, but usually there is always the situation where the analyst needs some support from the backend team or from someone who knows how the logic inside of the program works so that you fetch the data correctly or you know what to access. And all these scenarios, you kind of go back to the backenders just to realize like what was their intent when they wrote this program. And mostly, like 90% of the times, backenders wrote this program like a while ago. They also don't remember it. And they have a lot of stuff on their plate. So they're not like really up to communicate with you, not because they don't want, but because they are obviously really like overwhelmed with the other work. And like it can be to a little extent where you just need some help and support to make like your analytics better. Or it can be like the situation where obviously without the help, you'll be left with either a very inefficient report or dashboard, or you won't be able to do anything because it's just like will not lead anywhere. Like some key functionality is missing or some key connection is missing.
So yeah, Kate, I'm really curious. Are you talking about, because in this scenario, it was a technical piece that was missing, but are you talking about that kind of thing, or it sounds also like you might be talking about mostly just knowing what the data is supposed to represent? Like it's not necessarily a technical problem? Sometimes
not necessarily a technical problem, but it can also correlate to the lack of the technical, of the quality in technical realization sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in general, a theme that we kind of get back to, or that I have been circling around to in all these discussions over the past 2 years or so, is that this is a very generalizable problem. Like you can expand the question from being about tech to, as you did now, the say knowledge or understanding of what's in the data set and so forth. And then you have the introduction of metrics layers and metadata products and so forth. But I'm kind of curious as to, so how does this cooperation look between, there are other microservice functionalities out there, right? I feel that it's not new to be thinking of company operations as upstream and downstream, that you do something or make something and then someone else depends on that. That has been around for quite a while. So I'm curious as to how do, for instance, platform engineers and front-enders solve this exact same problem, if we generalize it to just be about people depending on each other.
Well, I mean, I think you might be able to do an episode on like similar problems between front-enders and back-enders, right? But I guess the simple answer is at least you have the idea that there's an API, there is an interface which is well defined, hopefully somewhat well documented. It's at least a concept and a layer in its own right. It's not just like you say to someone, okay, here's a database, and go and extract something from it. But no, you put some actual thought into designing the API, right?
Hopefully, you say. But what if it isn't? What processes are there in place in more traditional disciplines, maybe, if you know, that work to kind of solve these problems if they do appear? I mean, obviously, everyone would show up and be smart every day, but that's not really how it works. We have stress, we have investors, we are just aren't just tired, and we aren't smart every day. Humans aren't.
I mean, yeah, it mostly comes down to conventions. Like in APIs, you have the REST convention, which then I'm not even going to get into so much, but then that has different interpretations, sort of, and what is a good REST API, what is not, how do you deal with nested resources and stuff like that. But at least it's a starting point, I guess. And then, of course, more recently, we have GraphQL, which is sort of giving, I mean, it's kind of interesting in this context because it's a way of giving the front end or the consumers more power to get the data in the form that they want, so that they don't have to come to the backend developers every time they need a new widget or something. They can pull out the data and exactly the data that they want. And of course, if you have access to the full database, you already have a query language because you can query it with SQL. So, but I think maybe a comparable mechanism would be to have a separate schema for analytics, where you have, or where you can put in denormalizations or views combined, like pre-joined things for a particular purpose. It could be, I mean, in my mind, in my view, it could be for different kinds of consumers, where data analytics is one of them.
Right. So if I turn the same question, kind of business word, to Kate or Sara, does there exist a similar convention in, say, the communication that you, Kate, have with, say, business analysts or business stakeholders, like entirely non-technical personnel who you want to make things for? Do those conventions exist, or?
I had a little experience with the projects or like with systems where this was not the case, like this general communication issue either between your and backenders and other sides did not exist. But in that case, like all the interested parts were involved from the very beginning, like when backenders, analysts, business analysts, and let's say some key stakeholders from the business side were involved, like in the design discussion. In that case, analysts had their share of, like, at least telling that, by the way, we kind of want this to exist as well, or we want this field or this table to be accessible for us easily, or we feel that this connection between these two entities may be relevant in the future. And then also, like, we do have the same communications with like business analysts, where we on the ground discuss in the very, very beginning before we jump into the project, discuss some things that we may find very important. We can then redefine them, for example, but we still try to hold to this like definitions in the very beginning. If we speak like about purely business related things.
Right. So now you said definitions and keeping to definitions. And it's interesting because I was just thinking about, I was very briefly in legal practice, and lawyers are excellent at doing this particular thing. They will have arranged exactly, this is the document we expect from you. It has these 5 sections in which you explain exactly these 5 different things, 1 per section. That kind of maps onto the modern idea of a data contract, which is kind of the latest, greatest thing that we've ever come up with in the data layer, I'd say. But then Felix is telling us that this is already solved through, RESTful practices in the backend layer. So yeah, maybe we have a lot of stuff to learn from lawyers and backenders.
Yeah, exactly. I see what you're trying to do there with like the, say, how did other disciplines solve this problem? It's nice, but Kate, I really like what you said there about like bringing everybody together and having a discussion early on, because I think where it goes a little bit to kind of like, why does this problem happen in the entirely hypothetical scenario? You obviously have 2 people in the exact same company, and ultimately should be aligned towards the company's goals, but they end up having conflicting priorities. And I think what's powerful about what you described there, Kate, is if you bring people together in the same room and you have a discussion, then you create a joint ownership around like, what are we trying to do here, and what is this initiative about? And I guess that's one of those things that can really enable that communication or joint ownership and align those incentives.
Yeah, that can at least help you to reduce the amount of like communication issue if you talk before like you start implementing, or if you talk to someone before you start developing the report or dashboard.
So what do we do then if we did talk before, Kate, and then new problems emerge because we live in a dynamic, fast-paced startup environment?
Then you cry and beg for forgiveness. But no, obviously here you also try to communicate this not only to the backender, but also to the stakeholder. If something changed, then probably it's worth still reprioritizing this, keep in mind like everything else that everyone else has to do. Like the backenders have a lot of things on their plate. Stakeholders also have a lot of like things they have to solve every day. The data and business analysts have a lot of things that are essentially every day-to-day work. So maybe if we would look into each other's backlogs, not separately, but a little bit more together and more joint, that it will help us.
So that goes into a question, sorry, that I've been dying to ask Felix. It's like how, in my mind, backenders sit in their cave and aren't really aware of anything happening outside of the app. How true is that when Kate says like we should have some sort of insight into each other's backlogs and whatnot? How aware have you been when you've been doing platform work of like how others depend on what you do?
Well, I might not be the right person because I mostly worked in pretty small organizations. So I've always been pretty aware, I think, about what's going on in like other people's priorities and so on. I think, usually you have like a little bit of a mix of people. Some people really like to narrow down on their own focus, and some people like to be a little bit more big picture. So it's probably good to have both, and then make sure they're in the right places so that you have some people who can, go to meetings and sync up with other teams and so on, and then bring that back and prioritize things.
Natural liaisons, kind of.
Yeah, I think so. Those people exist, I think, who like to be a little bit more big picture, even though they're, they're backenders, for example.
I think this is kind of exactly what Sara told me the last week, and I was astonished then as well as I am now to hear that some people actually like to talk to each other.
Yeah. I wanted to add also a little bit to what we were talking about a few minutes ago about vocabulary and stuff like that. This is something I care a lot about. I think it used to be a pretty, I mean, there's a lot of tradition, let's say, in data modeling, establishing a business vocabulary, or a little bit more broadly, people sometimes talk about business rules, where you go a little bit farther than the vocabulary and, just have a clear reference for how the different terms relate to each other and stuff like that. And I think, unfortunately, it's not super advanced or complicated, but it's kind of fallen out of fashion. And I think that's one thing that can really help to, it's not like it magically solves everything, but I think it's a recurring theme. It's just like, we just don't know what this is supposed to mean. We have the data, but we don't know what it's supposed to mean. How should we interpret it? And so just doing, like what Kate was talking about, just doing some work in that area of making sure people, and what you usually see is, if you don't do it deliberately, then of course sooner or later someone has to come up with a name for something. And if you haven't done it in a organized way or in a deliberate way, then in the end, a developer trying to deliver a feature or a story will just like sit there, and they have to name a table or a column in a database, and they will just come up with something. In the best case, they discuss with the person next to them for 1 minute, and then that kind of easily becomes established vocabulary. And I mean, I've seen that many times. Like a month later, you hear someone from marketing department using that term that someone just came up with at the spur of the moment. And I think that's usually not great at all. Like, you have to be more careful about how you choose your terminology and stuff like that. And that makes everything easier for everyone.
Right. So talk more to each other and make sure words mean what you want them to mean. Like, so far, this is relationship counseling 101, kind of.
Mhm.
Like, talk more and understand each other when you do talk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had hour-long meetings where the only purpose was to kind of do some kind of mental archaeology to find out what everyone actually thinks a thing means. And then, of course, you discover everyone thinks different things. And then at the end, you reach some consensus. And then you should document that somewhere. But that's usually, I don't think many organizations have a good way of doing that. So
no, exactly. And I think that can be, sorry, Felix, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
I think that can be simply done, right? Like just a spreadsheet. And you can have like a glossary and just definitions, right? It doesn't have to be very advanced. Of course, it can be. And a reflection from me is that I've actually seen in bigger organizations how not having clear definitions for what different things mean in different data sets is causing multiple weeks of delay for kind of advanced analytics projects and delivering on like all of these cool data-driven things that the organization wants to do, but you can't figure out what things mean, so you can't use the data because you don't know if it is what you want it to be. But I actually had a question, Felix. So, because I agree it's really good to have these common definitions, but how does it help to solve the entirely hypothetical scenario? Maybe you can like walk me through, because I don't think I have like the technical understanding of how the backend is kind of helped by that. So that would be, I'm curious to hear.
I mean, in a way, that the entirely hypothetical scenario involved a little bit more of a technical problem where there was like not an index on a certain database column. So I'm not sure that can be solved immediately by this kind of methodology, but I think the mindset of, in a way, never considering the database as merely a technicality, like never, for example, like this is a stupid but very not uncommon example, like you might have something in your application code where you have 5 different kinds of something. but in the database, you just put like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a number. So it's impossible for someone trying to consume that they have to look in the documentation, but the documentation doesn't exist. So like Kate said from the start, they have to start and try to find a developer who knows and remembers and has time. So that's one example of you're considering it kind of just like a technical thing. Like the only important thing is that we have the state there in the database. But if you instead take a little bit less of a technical view of data and look at it as it's always like a form of communication. There's always going to be, people reading and consuming it. Then maybe you won't just use 1, 2, 3, or 5. And in the hypothetical scenario, you wouldn't put those special rows in that table in the first place, or you would like by having an explicit data model that's say apart from the database, maybe you would immediately see that there's something wrong with that, where you would like see that, okay, it should be a separate kind of entity is usually the terminology, right? Or it should be communicated in the database that this is something different. And so I mean, maybe that's a little bit overly optimistic, but I would at least say that if you have that sort of mindset, then there is a bigger chance that that scenario wouldn't occur in the first place.
Basically, clarity of communication, at least it doesn't hurt, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
But then you can turn that around also. If we, for instance, say that Alice in the example were to go to Celia the CEO and present, oh, the backenders aren't doing everything that I want them to do, that doesn't sound as good as the backenders are supposed to provide me with stuff that I can use to work. When we say provide, what do we mean? Like that can be a very powerful technique. Like, and surely it's good if you have clear definitions for everything, but we shouldn't underestimate that asking for a clear definition can also be it's a way to stay very fair, very neutral, and very productive with your communication. If you can kind of find that thing, whatever it is that itches in this scenario, anyone in this scenario could go to anyone else and say, hey, when you say this, when you say provide, when you say enable, when you say index, even anything, what do you mean?
That's a powerful question. Kate, I was observing your face when Felix was talking now, and it looked like you heard music. Is that a good, correct read?
To be honest, I kind of felt reading this scenario that Alice probably should go to Celia and tell her that backenders just need more time to design what they implement. Like they need more time to think what they do before they rush into a task. Like, because at least from the entirely hypothetical scenario, it sounds more like the backenders just get this like load of tasks they have to fulfill, but they don't have enough time to just sit down and, take a look at the bigger picture, as we discussed before. Take a look at what they have, take a look at what the company in general has, and then think how they want this to look like in the future. Because like, quote to quote, 2% at least aligned with the best practices. It's like nothing.
Well, so what you're saying is be compassionate. If the backenders aren't delivering, find out what their troubles are. That goes back to what you were saying before. Look, you can discuss your backlogs and, okay, so talk more, be more clear, and be compassionate. I feel like this is an excellent message.
Yeah, and don't run to CEO telling that Bob doesn't do his work. It's not the good way to achieve what you want to achieve, because Bob will be replaced with Mark, and Mark will be in the exact same situation in the end.
Exactly.
Also, one of the things, like the last thing you said, Kate, made me think is like, what if simply Alice and Bob went to Celia together and said, like, we have a problem, instead of one person saying, I have a problem, and that person, should do something. It's
maybe in that case, Alice and Bob just have to go to Celia and tell her that we have one problem and it's you, basically.
There you have the solution. The problem is top management.
Fire the CEO.
Get rid of them.
Yeah, fire the CEO.
Yeah.
Bob and Alice should be the CEO.
Yeah, exactly.
title of the episode right there. Fire the CEO.
Exactly. Yeah, do we have more questions that we want to ask before we kind of start wrapping up?
Not me. I'm feeling enlightened and enabled.
Yeah, good. Yeah,
and compassionate.
Yeah, I agree. I take with me, two, I think, big things, but the fact that data is actually communication also, and not like technicality. I think that was one of the really cool takeaways. And yeah, trying to drive alignment early on. Perfect. All right, but then yes, go ahead.
Wanted to add just like one of the things that we talked about a lot, documenting what you mean by different things. That one of the good things is that actually anyone can start doing that at any time. You don't really need anyone. Like every time you have that kind of conversation or meeting, you can just like write down, start on that Excel document that you talked about, and I think that's a really constructive thing that anyone can do at any time. And I also felt just in relation to one of the early questions from G about like what are some of the ways that people do it. And so there is this methodology called domain-driven design, and that can get really complicated and kind of technical and stuff. But I just want to mention it because it's all about kind of the same thing, starting from how like the mental model that people actually have, make sure that it's aligned, and then write that down, and then write the code or design the database to fit that, and not always trying to just go the other way, do everything in the reverse order, so to speak. Data is not about databases, it's about mental models. And then you can use different databases as tools.
I love to say it's all just bytes. That's kind of my go-to. All of the stuff that we're making, all of them, all of the money and all of the insights and all of that just comes from a series of numbers between 0 and 255, and that's all that exists. Even this video call is just a bunch of numbers between 0 and 255 served at incredible speed, served up by really smart processes, figured out by really smart people. And that's all that we have. And that goes back to that, like you have data, it's just a big pile of these numbers. That's all that it is. And whatever you kind of project onto it, whatever the meaning those numbers have to you, whatever sense they can make in the context that you're working, that's the important stuff. That's where we kind of want to go.
Exactly.
So
I once worked with a developer who said that code should be self-documenting, and if it weren't, the code wasn't good enough, which obviously, resulted in people not being able to work with his code because there were no comments. But that's a separate story. My point was, maybe what you're saying, Felix, is that data should be self-documenting. But like if you look at a table or something, then you should immediately understand like how does this relate to the business, and that's how you should like think about the data model. Does that make sense?
Probably like the data model should be self-explaining. Like
yeah.
But no, I'll protest.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, interesting.
Why?
No, because that means that, okay, so we should all strive to, for instance, name a column in such a way that people understand the semantics related to this column, but then you're inviting people to have their own interpretation. That goes directly against the idea of being really clear. And I think, again, taking the kind of a relationship counseling approach to this is the problem, right? If you're like, oh, we should all strive to have good intuition or say things that are intuitive. I'd say no, strive to say things that are
clear.
Strive to say things that are in a certain way. Strive to explain what you said.
I think in some way that I'm not able to explain, I agree with both. I think I really like, it's good to strive for code being self-explanatory, because in the end, you can argue like comments, like you can write great comments or documentation, but then someone or you, when you're in in a stressful situation, you would change the code, and you won't remember to change the comment. So in a way, in the end, the code is the most authoritative source of truth. But and I think the same. So I'm also in favor of really trying to design the database in a way that it's easy to understand without like having like these magic numbers like I had an example, like with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, use strings instead or something, or an enum, so that it's so people can understand it. But I still think you have to start from having a mental model, and it's good to make that explicit with diagrams or documentation, and then you try to implement that in the code as well.
Also, there is a solution. It's just we were just sitting here talking about different approaches to the problem, but there's also is also a solution.
There's some good ideas, and I think the domain-driven design is kind of well known among developers to some extent, but I think it's just kind of there's a lot in that. There used to be a lot of work in that area, but most of it is forgotten. But for some reason, that kind of survived. So there are good ideas out there about data modeling, just classic. Like you can get a classic data modeling book from the 90s, and it will usually have a lot of material that's really useful for this kind of stuff compared to modern data books that's just about pipelines and stuff.
I love those recommendations. They're very cool. Kate, do you have any kind of final things to add, or anything else you've been thinking about that you think we should share with our listeners?
I think just as a team, don't let yourself get isolated and trapped down by your issues and your problems, because like if you get horribly isolated from the other tech parts, then in the end, the amount of problems you'll have on your plate will just grow and grow, because you won't have a possibility to address them correctly. And like, if you hear that there is a project starting, maybe try to get involved in the early stages, like just to get to know what is going on there. Maybe building some easiest analytics when this application or system is just implemented is a good way for you to go to at least grasp a bit of the data, get the understanding, and then like also to see what you may need in the future from this part. I try to get involved in everything. Like
exactly. No, that's fantastic. But I think we're gonna wrap it up here. So thank you so much, Kate and Felix, and of course Lee, for the time and for this fantastic insights. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
It was a pleasure to meet all of you, as always. So thanks, guys, for joining.
Thanks for inviting.
A lot of fun.
Yeah, so much fun. And take care.
Hey.
Bye.
See you all.
Have a nice weekend. Bye.